Well, this morning I'd like to commence what I'm going to add to this channel on a regular basis. I'm going to do a destination hike with tree identification. Today I'm at the Red River Gorge. This is in Wolfe and Powell County, Kentucky, kind of straddling the border here, about 50 miles east of Lexington. It's a very popular destination for backpacking, day hiking, camping, rock climbing, whitewater sports, and anything else that you might like to do in the outdoors. And that's what this channel is about, helping you appreciate and understand what you're hiking through and hiking past. So we're going to be looking at some of the common trees in the Red River Gorge, and maybe even some uncommon ones. It's the last week of March here. We got a little early spring flowering going on some of these trees. Got just a little bit opening up on this spice bush here, which is on this channel. So I'll indicate which species are on the channel already. Many of them are. And we're looking up at some rock formations with pine trees covering the tops. Off in the distance here, I'm at the actual Red River crossing on the Sheltowee Trace, which is Kentucky's version of the Appalachian Trail. It's not as long, but it does cover the entire Daniel Boone National Forest through the state of Kentucky. About 200 miles in length, and it has a suspension bridge right up the trail here where it crosses the Red River. And the Red River is running a little brown today from some heavy rains this last couple days. We've got some huge chunks of sandstone that have broke off. Up in the distance, it's called Chimney Top Rock. It's being backlit right now, but there's a huge rock formation up there. And those rock formations are common in this park. That's what makes it so interesting and attractive to hikers, campers, hunters, and you name it. So we'll be back here about 7 or 8 hours. We'll put as many trees on the list as we can today without being too duplicative. So I'll just mention what I'm finding and film it. And the details of how to identify these trees are on this channel. There's a little pointer there from that tree branch showing the parking lot where I'm starting this hike. And the orange highlighting are some of the trails I might use to record the trees that are common and sometimes uncommon in this park. We'll see how the trail conditions allow. There's some wet crossings on some of these major streams that may be a little too high to ford or rock hop, so we'll decide which trails we're going to take after we cross the bridge here on the Sheltowee Trace, and we'll determine our course based on trail conditions. But I would like to get up on some of these ridges and check out some of these pine stands, which are probably there because of recent forest fire activity. And I always let Mother Nature really decide what I'm going to record on these hikes, unless I have a certain species in mind, which I often do. But even then, we can get a little bit distracted by some neat things we find along the way. And this is certainly a tree I had in mind to add to this hike. And here's a perfect place to look at it. We're right on the suspension bridge crossing the Red River on the Sheltowee Trace. And this is one of the early risers in late March, early April. These are the very large buds of a yellow buckeye tree. Get that beautiful pinkish purple color as they open up, and they get very large leaves. And not as many buckeye nuts as I find on the Ohio buckeye trees. I haven't had much luck finding the nuts from these trees, but they do get them. And the bark is just slightly different from the Ohio buckeye. There may be Ohio buckeye back here too, but I'm fairly certain these are yellow buckeyes because of the geography of where that tree species is found, which is the Appalachian Mountains, south of the Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Maryland border, all the way down into North Georgia. And this is considered the Appalachian Plateau here, but it's still the same soils and geography as the higher Appalachian Mountains. This is low country here. It never gets above 1,500 feet. Even on the tops, bottom lands are 700-800 feet, so we're not going to find trees here that just grow at the higher elevations of the Appalachian Mountains. We may find some that do grow at the higher elevations of the Appalachian Mountains, but not the ones that only grow there. Yellow buckeye is most easily distinguished by these large potato chip sized flakes on the bark as the tree matures. Also has larger leaves and larger flowers than the Ohio Buckeye. And it can be found in the moister soils, even at higher elevations, the Appalachian Mountains. So I've got more on that on this channel, several different videos from different phases of the leaf out, from the buds to the leaf out to the flowers to the blight or the fungal infection that it gets in late summer. And in this part of the Central Appalachians, the only trees with white bark are the sycamores, and that's on the upper branches of these mature trees. Most of the hiking trails and recreational opportunities in this Red River Gorge are not along bottomlands that are of larger streams. They're more mountain streams. But this part of the Sheltowee Trace is going to be following some bottomland for about a half a mile, and we're going to see what's along here before we head up what's called Chimney Top Creek, which is more of a mountain stream, which wouldn't have a lot of sediment along the banks. It's more boulders and rocks. But along many major streams, and even smaller streams, you can find sycamore trees. And I mentioned the yellow buckeye was an early riser. Well, the sycamore is often the last tree to get its leaves. Sometimes not till the end of May, even in warmer locations. Right next to it here in the shade, but it can be seen here that it's already got its flowers. This is some box elder, which is real common along this bottomland and a lot of bottomlands in this part of the country. And almost every one of these box elder trees back here is covered in moss. Here's one right here with a little better lighting here. And if you can find one that's growing straight, you'll be a lucky person. This one's covered in moss. They're interesting trees, but they're definitely scraggy, and I've got several clips on the box elder on this channel, as well as the sycamore. Let's continue on this bottomland here, and I think there's some river birch hanging out around here. Let's see if we can find one that's good for making a video, and maybe even a little sweet gum. I often say that March often is like a second fall in the mid-Ohio Valley and central Appalachians. We can get some really blue skies when it's not raining. And a cool, crisp day. Great for hiking, folks. You can see some of the... This is actually unnamed on any of the maps. That's how common these cliffs are. Something as striking as that 200-foot thick layer of sandstone here at the Red River Gorge doesn't even have a name on any of my maps. And there's no trails to the top of it. It's pretty much cliffs around that whole bluff there, but here's some more of our sycamore, and this blue sky is sure making it easy to study it. And one tree that's in the shade here, but we're going to mention it. We do have some river birch along here. Not a lot of it, but there's a few trees. I've done quite a bit of work on the river birch in the New River Gorge a couple of years ago on this channel. I got two different clips on the smaller and larger trees. This one's large enough that it doesn't have the obviously flaking bark that you might find in a lawn specimen. It's a common landscape plant. But if you go far enough up the tree, you can find that type of bark. Just a beautiful day to be outdoors here. And we're going to be heading up the holler of Chimney Top Creek and up to the tops of some of these ridges to study the pines and other evergreens that might be growing here. And let's start looking at some of the evergreen trees that grow in the Red River Gorge. This one can be found on the lower slopes and especially common on the upper slopes. And it tends to be larger on the upper slopes that I have found here at the Red River Gorge. This American holly, which has got an evergreen leaf, which is unique. You won't confuse it with anything else. Now there are some garden varieties that might be slightly different, but this is the one that grows in the central and southern Appalachians. I've seen it in Pennsylvania, but that's about as far north as it gets. The larger trees can get red berries. It's called dioecious, so you need a male and a female tree to get berries, and if you don't have both, you often get these trees without them. And a very common plant in the Appalachian Mountains on the slopes that aren't extremely dry or fire prone is the eastern hemlock. I've done a lot of work on that on this channel. But we can tell that from the pines that grow back here by the much shorter needles that are flat. So these needles here, probably not more than a ½ inch long, and they're flat on both sides. And I've got 5 species of common pines in the Appalachian Mountains that I've put on this channel, and 4 of them grow in this park, and we'll try to find all 4. I'm pretty confident we can find most of them. But here's our white pine. Just a seedling here. With the softer needles that are long and soft to the touch. And it won't show up here, but they do have a little white line along the green part of the needle. We'll head up the ridges. We can start finding some of the more drought-tolerant pines. And as we start to climb up the hillside here, we're fading away from some hemlocks and pines. And the mid-slopes here on the Appalachian Mountains are often covered in white oak. It's a very common tree. Less tolerant of drought conditions and fire, so we're less likely to find it on the ridge tops. But this mid-slope, we've got all kinds of white oaks. I stopped here because this is mostly white oak growing back here. And the bark is an ash gray. It can flake in places. In other places it's a little smoother, but always has these vertical lines with some cross lines as well. So it's a pretty common tree. Here's a look at a white oak leaf. And the notches between the lobes are rounded, and the lobes themselves are rounded. I've got several segments on the white oak tree on this channel. And on those segments I compare it to some other trees that might be confused with it. But the post oak, the chinkapin oak, and the bur oak, I'd be surprised to find back here. Those are trees that can be confused with it. But white oak is a common tree in these mountains. It's a common tree to be harvested for lumber. And let's take a second look at some of these trees I've already mentioned. Here's some more American holly in the understory of this forest. And a white oak with its ash gray bark. Tends to flake off in places. There's a medium-sized holly back here, probably 15 feet high. And behind it, we've got some hemlock and some white pine. And some beautiful rock formations here, folks. That's the main attraction at this park. There's sandstone arches, there's cliffs. I think it rivals the beauty of the Southwest with these sandstone cliffs and formations, but covered in trees in many places. Well, let's admire this beautiful day and revisit a couple of these plants. It's always good to have more than one tree to look at, but here's some more white oak. Very common on these mid-slopes, as I mentioned. So we're a couple hundred feet, maybe 100 feet above Chimney Top Creek, maybe 300 feet below the ridge line. And these ridge lines are often very common views along them. Some of them don't have official trails, but the hikers have made trails on their own over the years. Here's a common tree you can find almost any hike you do. It's got a smooth gray bark, and most of the time it can get a little bumpy at times when the tree's under stress. But here's our American beech with some pointed buds that are fairly small and pointed. And it tends to hold its lower leaves on the leaves on the lower branches and saplings tend to hang on all winter long. I've got a little segment on that on this channel called Marcescent Leaves of the American beech tree. A common tree can get quite large. And the smooth gray bark, let's keep that, make a mental note of that, folks, because we're going to find some magnolias back here that have a smooth gray bark as well that from a distance could be confused with the American beech, but as we get up closer to them, we'll find that there's some obvious differences. And as we come southbound on the Sheltowee Trace, we're very close to Chimney Top Creek now. We've come down from that mid-slope area. And we've still got our yellow Buckeye with these very large leaves starting to open up. That bud is about the size of the top half of my forefinger, and the leaves get much larger than that. And I think mountain stream in the central Appalachians, I think musclewood. Now, it grows in a lot of woodlands, not just along these mountain streams, but it's very common along these mountain streams. And right in front of it is our spice bush, which is common in the moister soils of the Appalachian foothills here and throughout the Ohio Valley. In late March is when we often find it in bloom. Our musclewood has a unique gray bark with the texture of a muscular person, one who's worked out a lot. Name for that is American hornbeam. There's also a tree that's second cousin to the musclewood called the hop hornbeam, which has a bark that looks much different. I haven't found it back here, but both of those are on this channel. We're going to continue up here and eventually make our way up onto one of these ridge tops. We looked at that white pine seedling a few minutes ago. Well, here's how big they can get, folks. This guy's got to be 120 feet high. He's taller than these hemlocks, which can also get quite large. We're going to look at some other pines up on the ridgetop, but the bark on these white pine trees as they get larger is got real obvious chunks and ridges that are slightly different than the other pines. And I mentioned that the smooth bark on the American beech tree there's a few other trees that might have smooth gray bark as well, but they're definitely different once you get up close. Here's a clump of trees growing right here, a whole family of them growing up from the ground with smooth gray bark. But the buds are much different and the leaves are much different. Come back here in the summer and you'll be treated to what looks like a tropical display of the foliage of the umbrella magnolia. And look at the size of these buds compared to that of the American beech. 3 or 4 times longer, much wider. They vary from like a frog green color to a purple color on this one here. I've got 4 magnolias on this channel. I believe 3 of them are found in this park. I don't believe there's any Fraser magnolia back here, at least not according to the range maps. But these umbrella magnolias get huge foliage. I've got that on this channel. I've got the buds on the channel. And I've also got the big leaf magnolia, which is common back here too. But look up at this umbrella magnolia. It's all going all different directions. And the beech trees tend to be much more orderly in their form. And we've got some more eastern white pine reaching for the sky here. We're making our way up toward the ridgetop location where we can expect to find more species of pine. Got a little bit of hemlock left here with those short needles. And I got a second variety of oak to add to this hike. It's a common oak in the soils that aren't extremely dry or fire prone. And this is our northern red oak. People often say the furrows on the bark kind of look like the tracks a skier would make as they come down the mountain with the zigging and zagging. The furrows aren't usually extremely deep. These are covered in moss, so it's a little hard to tell. But it's a medium to large sized tree. And probably not too common in these valleys in the bottomlands, but once you get up on the ridges, it's not as common as the white oak that I've seen so far, but it is a common tree throughout the area covered by this channel. And the way I can tell it's a red oak is the acorns. Boy, the turkeys and the squirrels have eaten the acorns, but look at the size of those acorn caps, much larger than some of the other trees that it could be confused with. They're about the size of a U.S. currency quarter. And the leaf could resemble a black oak, which probably grows on this mountain too. So I'm using the acorns, the bark, and the leaf to tell it apart. And all those trees are on this channel with much more detail. And while hiking the trails of the Red River Gorge Recreation Area, especially on these mid to upper slopes, you start seeing in the winter and early spring what looks like some Somebody made a mess of the woods. Looks like somebody littered it with all these off-color, real bright or light tan leaves that are quite large. My nickname for this tree is the Litter Bug Magnolia because these leaves are huge. 20, 25 inches long, brown on one side, almost white on the other, and when the bottom side is facing up, it looks like somebody made a mess of the woods. Well, the tree that made a mess of the woods creates incredible foliage in the summertime. And this is a close cousin to that umbrella magnolia, but the foliage is slightly different. I've got videos of that from last year on this channel, and the buds as well on this channel. So here's the bud of our big leaf magnolia. And it is a fuzzy white instead of that greenish purple. See if we can get that. There we go. So it's about 1.5 inches long, and it creates leaves that are huge. And it grows in clumps and has smooth gray bark, just like the umbrella magnolia. And a lot of people don't realize there's actually 2 varieties of magnolia in this park that are common, that have huge leaves. And the details of how to tell those leaves apart are on this channel. But one way to tell them apart this time of year is just the umbrella magnolia does not leave a mess on the ground like this litter bug or big leaf magnolia does. So during the winter and early spring, that's pretty good clue that you've got some big leaf magnolia growing around you. And I'm starting to see some Virginia pines and other pines on this ridgetop. We'll take a closer look at those in just a few minutes. And we've come probably about 2 miles south of that suspension bridge where this hike commenced. We've come up several hundred feet in elevation, and boy, we're finding the pines now. I believe there's been some forest fires on this ridge in the last 20 years by the number of pine trees I'm finding and the size of them. In many of these pine trees, the cones will not open and start a new pine tree unless it's been heated up by the sun or a forest fire. So it needs to know that there's a good opportunity to grow, and it won't try to grow in the shade of other hardwood trees. So you can see way above there is a much larger, I believe, pitch pine tree, 60 feet higher than these little ones. And this is mostly pitch and Virginia pine growing on this ridge here. A little bit of white pine in the mix. We've got a nice Virginia pine right here with some beautiful cones to look at. There's our cones right up here. So the Virginia pine cones tend to be fairly small compared to the white pine. And they're shaped like an ice cream cone, if you want to look at it that way. The needles are twisted and they're in twos, so they tend to wrap around each other on the Virginia pine, and the needles on the right are from Virginia pine. The needles in the middle are come in threes. That's from a pitch pine, which is also growing up here. And our white pine, I had one here, it's kind of small, but they can get longer than that. It's got needles of 5. We'll continue on, see if we can find a 4th pine up here called shortleaf pine. And we'll continue our ridgetop hiking here at the Red River Gorge. One oak tree that's especially well adapted to the limitations of growing on a ridge where the soil dries out and is prone to brush fires. This is the Chestnut Oak. It's really thick bark. So these furrows, this is a small tree, maybe only 30, 40 years old, and the furrows are already 1.5 inches deep on the larger specimens, and they can get huge. The furrows are 2 or 3 inches deep. They rival the furrows you'd find on a large cottonwood. And stays furrowed pretty much the whole way up. Got a really large pitch pine growing right next to it in the shade, a little harder to see here. This is what those pitch pines look like as they get larger. You can notice the bark is much different than that of the white pine. It has these really large plates that are well defined as you look up the tree. So does the shortleaf pine. I don't find as much of it in this park as they do the pitch pine. But we'll take a look at that if we can find some. But back to the chestnut oak. It's got these leaves with a wavy edge. And it's real common on these ridge tops. You can see this leaf litter is all chestnut oak. The scarlet oak also shares these ridge tops. Unlike the chestnut oak, it's not brown on both, it's brown on both sides. Chestnut oak is brown on one side in the winter, and a light color on the other side. The Scarlet Oak gets a beautiful scarlet color in the fall and almost looks like flames the way this leaf forks out. And the cap on the Scarlet Oak is smaller than that of the Red Oak we just saw, and it shines in the sunlight, so it looks like it's been lacquered or varnished. That's how we can tell it from the Red Oak. And there's a Scarlet Oak growing right behind this pitch pine tree, and without the leaves or the nuts, it kind of looks like a red oak or a black oak, so we need more than one way to look at it, but it's more common on these ridge tops. And we'll just look at the tops of some of these Virginia and pitch pine trees. Many of these trees in the Appalachian Mountains keep their cones for years. They don't always come down, but when they do come down, and there's some source of opening the cones, either a lot of sun or fire or both, we can get dense stands of this undergrowth. And this is mostly pitch pine and Virginia pine in here. A little bit of white pine making its way in here as well. It's just a softer color, a little bit of white line on there if you look carefully. But look at the number of cones up there. There's hundreds of them on this matured pitch pine. Actually, this one's a Virginia pine. We can't get a good look at the bark from here, but I can. And this one's a pitch pine. So this is Mother Nature getting ready for the next fire. And boy, when these cones drop, up comes the forest of seedlings here. And these areas with bare rock and thin soil are the perfect habitat for Virginia pine. We've got our share of pitch pine on this trail, but this is almost all Virginia pine here. We've got those shorter needles that are twisted around each other right next to this cone here. So they come in twos. The pitch pine comes in threes. Not sure if we're going to find shortleaf pine, but it comes in twos and threes. Here's some mature Virginia pines with much smaller plates on the bark than the white pine or the pitch pine. So they're about the size of, well, they're kind of flaky there for one thing, and they're not very large, maybe about the size of a cookie or a potato chip, kind of like that bark we saw on the yellow Buckeye a few hours ago. But look at all those cones up there. So what a perfect day for photography and videos, folks. I'm getting near my lunch point, and there's probably a few more trees we can find on the way back. I'm not going to loop around today. I think I'm just going to stay on this trail. So we'll keep adding a few more trees to this, but we've done a lot of them already. A lot of the common ones on this particular end of the park. And let's enjoy our view from this lunch rock, I'm going to call it. This is all sandstone on the cliffs and upper elevations of this park. So it makes for great views and very scenic. And off in the distance we can see some rock formations on the next ridges, and just can see how common the evergreens are here, especially these pines, the three that I've mentioned. There's one in the foreground here that's actually been burned, so there's evidence of our forest fire right there. And it burned hot enough to burn all the way to the top of that tree, and that was probably a 40-foot tree. And just behind these younger Virginia pines, I see the skeleton of a burned pine tree as well. So my guess that this area had burned was correct, and I've also read up on the fact that this area was burned in 2016. At least parts of it was. That was a real dry year in the Appalachian Mountains in the fall. A lot of terrible fires down in Gatlinburg that fall. And this area had some fires that got away from people's campsites. So if you are camping in a place like this, be extra careful to get your fire completely out. But you can see our mixture of pines and hardwoods. And we'll add a few more on the hike back. And here is one of the reasons why this park is so popular. Scenic rewards without not always that many miles to get your reward. In this case, it was about 3 or 4 miles of undulating hiking, not extremely steep. And there's that unnamed rock that I commented on a couple hours ago. It's separated from the main ridge here, so there's no way up there that I can see, on this face at least, without rock climbing equipment. Way down below there is the parking lot for the suspension bridge entrance to the Sheltowee Trace. So we've made a big loop. Looks like a cinnamon roll almost. Here's some more of our scenic features here, folks. So I'm going to just point on the map where we went. And this is meant to help people with tree identification, but let's go ahead and track our course too, because this is a day hike, which originated at the suspension bridge on the Sheltowee Trace, crossed the bridge and came south on this trace about 1.6 miles, and then came east on the Sheltowee Trace 1.2 miles, and then I got on an unofficial trail to where it says V in River, and this is an unofficial trail. This is called Hanson's Point. All trails can get you out here if you follow their directions. It's on a ridge top from the main trail. It's not extremely steep, but there's a maze of trails back here, none of which are marked. But the app will help you find it, or just good old-fashioned navigation using the topographic maps. So we got quite a few trees identified on the way out here. My time's a little limited now, but we might try to get a couple more on the way back. And when hiking this park 20 years ago, I remember this particular ridge being open woods, but there's been quite a few brush fires back here. As you can see, it's very thick with new pine trees, white pine, Virginia pine, and pitch pine. Even a little hemlock trying to make its way in here. And another hardwood tree that I haven't commented on, but I'm finding it on these trails, but not in great size. Okay, they're mostly just coming in where there's an opportunity. We've got some small red maples here with those beautiful early spring flowers backlit against this perfect blue sky today. And this is late March, so that's when you would often find it in bloom at this latitude. And it's got these bright red stems where the new growth from last year is situated. As the stem or the branch gets older, it becomes more of an even gray color and eventually becomes furrowed. I've got plenty of that on this channel. You can learn how to compare that with the sugar maple. But it's often a pioneer species up here. Matter of fact, you hardly ever find red maple saplings in places where there's deep shade. Some of the swamp forests where I live in Warren County, Ohio, we've got lots of red maple, but it's all large maples, and there's nothing coming up underneath it in those areas unless the area has some sun. Well, let's add a second birch to our list of trees we found on today's hike. This is a very common birch tree in the Appalachian Mountains. This is called the black birch or sweet birch. You can see what looks like some, well, they're almost considered cones, but they're long and narrow and cling to the tree sometimes. This sweet birch is just a small sapling here. I haven't found any large sweet birches on this particular trail. Again, I believe there was some fire damage back here. These trees are probably just getting reestablished, but like most birches, it has these horizontal lines on the bark, at least on the younger branches. Let's see if those are coming into focus there. So some of the cherry trees get that look too. If you have any doubt, you can scratch yourself off just a little bit of the bark here, get down to where it looks green, and you can smell the wintergreen flavor inside that branch. And if you do that to a cherry sapling, choke cherry, fire cherry, black cherry, it gets a real nasty bitter smell and taste. So the sweet birch has a sweet taste. If you were to remove a few of the smaller branches, it has a real sweet flavor. You can actually put it in some warm water and make tea out of it. And this is in the understory of this pine forest here. But with the right kind of conditions, it can become quite a large tree.